Okay, good afternoon. My name is Alan English, and this is Alain and Alphie Pritchard.
Good afternoon, folks. We're back again after 3 weeks, 4 weeks?
3.
Yeah, about 3 weeks. Carrying on with the where we left off, basically. This afternoon should be quite interesting. We're looking at women in war, and particularly women in the Third Reich and women in the Soviet Union. Two very different attitudes, ideological attitudes towards women. The Nazi attitude towards women was that women were very subservient. They were given, if you look at the Nazi hierarchy, women are not mentioned at all. You have to delve down into the ideology to find out what role women were allocated in that particular, in the Nazi regime. What were their roles? How did they function? And so we're looking at, I'll be looking at women in war in Nazi Germany, and Alan will be picking up on women in the Soviet Union in war. So Alan, can I hand over to you?
Sure. I mean, though the basis for this study was a book by Svetlana Alexievich called The Unwomanly Face of War. And this discusses a subject not much examined in historical in history, at least not publicly. And it was what we're looking at really. Okay, is what are the individual experiences of these women? Okay, and what were their job roles? How did they express, articulate themselves? How did they really live? Yeah, and it's a fascinating book. I mean, what Svetlana did was, she walked around with a tape recorder and just to various women she'd heard about who knew had worked for the Soviet army in World War II. She basically just let them speak. It's got a number of fascinating different passages here, and I'm just going to read them out. And this was someone who was a nurse in the middle of World War II, and she discusses this and of death and astonishment in the face of death. She says, people didn't want to die. We responded to every moan, every cry. One wounded man, when he felt he was dying, seized me by the shoulder, embraced me, and wouldn't let go. It seemed to him that if someone was next to him, if the nurse was there, life wouldn't leave him. He asked, just 5 more minutes of life, just 2 more minutes. Some died inaudibly, quietly. Others cried out, I don't want to die. Men cursed, fuck it all. One man started to sing a Moldavian song. A man is dying, but he still doesn't believe he's dying. But you see this yellow colour coming from underneath the hairline. You see the shadow moving first over the face, then down under the clothes. He lies dead, and on his face there's some sort of astonishment, as if he's lying there thinking, how is it I'm dead? Can it be I'm dead? As long as he can hear, till the last moment you tell him, no, how could you die? You kiss him, embrace him. There now, he's already dead, eyes fixed on the ceiling, but I still whisper something, soothing him. The names are erased, gone from my memory, but the faces are still there. We're used to hearing about the kind of the male side of war, and how it's just viewed in from the male soldier's eyes, but this is something very unique and vital. That perspective being discussed here. I want to look at maybe a couple of others perspectives, let's see what else we can find here. And okay, this is from a lady called Alexandra Semyonovna Popova, Lieutenant of the Guards, a pilot. Okay, so you understand here, with just this statement alone, women were more than just nurses or backroom workers. Some of them actually fought in this war. And this is this lady's story, Alexandra Alexandra Semyonovna Popova, Lieutenant of the Guards, pilot. Our regiment was all women. We flew to the front in May 1942. The planes they gave us were PO2s, small, slow. They flew only at a low level, hedge hopping, just over the ground. Before the war, young people in flying clubs learned to fly in them, but no one could have imagined they would have any military use. The plane was constructed entirely of plywood, covered with aircraft fabric, in fact with cheesecloth. One direct hit and it caught fire and burned up completely in the air before reaching the ground, like a match. The only solid metal part was the M11 motor. Later on, toward the end of the war, we were issued parachutes, and a machine gun was installed in the pilot's cabin. But before, there had been no weapon, except for 4 bomb racks under the wings. That's all. Nowadays, they'd call us kamikazes, and maybe we were kamikazes. Yes, we were. But victory was valued more than our lives. Victory. You ask how we could endure it. I'll tell you. Before I retired, I became ill from the very thought of how I could possibly not work. Why then, I had completed a second degree in my 50s. I became a historian. I had been a geologist all my life, but a good geologist is always in the field, and I no longer had the strength for it. A doctor came, took a cardiogram, and asked, "Why did you have a heart attack?" "What heart attack?" "Your heart is scarred all over." I must have acquired those scars during the war. You approach a target and just shaking all over. Your whole body is shaking because below it's all gunfire. Fighter planes are shooting, anti-aircraft guns are shooting. Several girls had to leave the regiment. They couldn't stand it. We flew mostly during the night. For a while they tried sending us on day missions, but gave it up at once. A rifle shot could bring down a PO2. We did up to 12 flights a night. I saw the famous ace Pokryshkin when he returned from a fighting mission. He was a sturdy man, not 20 and not 23 like us, but while his plane was refueled, a technician took his shirt off and wrung it out. It was soaked as if he had been in the rain, so you can easily imagine what it was like for us. You come back and you can't even get out of the cabin. They used to pull us out. We couldn't carry the chart case. We dragged it on the ground. And the work our girl armourers did. We had to attach 4 bombs to the aircraft by hand. That meant 800 pounds. They did it all night. One plane takes off, another lands. The body reorganised itself so much during the war that we weren't women. We didn't have those women's things. Periods, And after the war, not all of us could have children. We all smoked. I also smoked. It made you feel as if you'd calmed down a little. You come back to the earth shaking all over, you light a cigarette, and you calm down. We wore leather jackets, trousers, army shirts, plus a fur jacket in winter. Like it or not, something masculine appeared in your gait and your movements. When the war was over, they made us khaki-coloured dresses. We suddenly felt we were young girls. It's amazing, the literal transformation that takes place. When they say they didn't feel like women anymore, that kind of their bodies were changed, their whole mentality, their attitudes towards life, and it gets worse. I'm gonna find a.
Can I just
sure.
make a point here?
Sure.
The one that I'm going to talk about. Sorry, my voice is still not 100% fit. But we can look at the difference as well if we've got time later. It's a book called Hitler's Furies, German Women in the Nazi Killing Fields by Wendy Lower. Now, it's a totally different view of war. This is a book which I'm still trying to gather my thoughts around. And it's about the role of women in Nazi Germany in the killing fields. And the killing fields was Poland and the Ukraine. And it's a million miles away from the experience or the experiences of the women that Alan are talking about. And that partly is because of the role of women within the ideology of the Nazi regime. Women were set a particular role. Their body was there simply to give birth to the Aryan race. That was the part of the ideology. Another part, of course, was that women were never in the echelons of the regime. They were secretaries, they were teachers, and they were nurses, mostly. But their experiences in this book highlights also the role of the observer of women, who was observing what the SS were doing in the killing fields and what their reactions were. So we'll come back to that in a moment. It's a million miles away. They were not fighters, unlike the women in the Soviet Union. So the experiences were totally different. Also, what I'm discovering in this book, there was a complete denial on the part of the women who were interviewed in this book about what was actually going on, even though they spoke about it. So you have to work that one out. They was in denial of what they was actually seeing. And you begin to wonder, it's not just about blaming the Germans, it's looking at an ideology that can treat human life as a rag doll, basically. Alan?
Yeah, I mean, it just says, what was forbidden for a lot of these women? I mean, it was in the way that was, I think it was meant to improve their efficiency under Stalin's army regime, was that these women could not fall in love. Yeah, but having said that, love was ironically what saved some of these women. I mean, this is a brief testimony here from Sophia Kreigel, who was a sergeant major, a sniper. And she says in this book, we arrived at the first Belarusian front. 27 girls. Men looked at us with admiration. Not laundresses, not telephone operators, but sniper girls. It's the first time we've seen such girls. What girls! The sergeant major composed a poem in our honour. The sense of it was that girls should be delicate, like roses in May, and the war shouldn't cripple their souls. As we were leaving for the front, each of us gave an oath. There will be no romances here. It would all happen if we survived after the war. Before the war, we didn't even have time to kiss. We looked at these things more strictly than young people nowadays. For us, to kiss meant love for the rest of your life. At the front, love was forbidden. If the superiors found out about it, one of the couple, as a rule, was transferred to another unit. They were simply separated. We cherished our love and kept it secret. We didn't keep our childish oaths. We loved. I think that if I hadn't fallen in love at the war, I wouldn't have survived. Love saved us. It saved me. one more section I want to go at, and this is again from the author's perspective, talking about talking to these women and the effects it has on her. I mean, just gotta can't see if I can get to it. It's very, very, very moving. You can't. Jesus. And this is the author talking as she's talking to these women. She says, "I don't see the end of this road. The evil seems infinite to me. I can no longer treat it only as history. Who will answer me? What am I dealing with, time or human beings? Times change, but human beings? I think about the dull repetitiveness of life. They've spoken as soldiers, as women. Many of them were mothers." That's like the irony here. That's what we're talking about. Just. I mean, we've spoken many a time about the dehumanizing effects of war, and it's true. I mean, it's a truism about war, but we very rarely see it discussed in public life in this specific way. And this is how it affects women specifically. I mean, it'd be interesting to kind of hear, alternatively, from what are the kind of like the child's perspective in war, for instance. You know what I mean? And kind of different. The administrators and the prisoners. I mean, just this kind of random different perspective, because I think the different perspectives you get on this subject, the better your understanding is inevitably going to be. But unfortunately, the culture, at least as I see it, is driven far too much towards that of the male soldier and the kind of like the myth of the male soldier as hero. And I remember, this is slightly off topic here, I once visited the Gordon Highlanders Museum in Aberdeen, and I was kind of speaking there about. I spoke there to two veterans who kind of spoke, who were there at the museum, and they kind of spoke to museum guests about their experiences in the war. And one of them told me, I've not forgotten this, don't be a hero. They live fast and they die young. We weren't fighting for our country, we were fighting for our lives. That's it. I mean, that's it in a nutshell from the soldier's perspective. And it's really, really nails. I mean, that although he was talking from a kind of a male soldier's perspective, he was kind of speaking for speaking for all people who experience war. You're fighting for your life. Patriotism, it's just it's a political invention. It's not. It's ridiculous, but it's one that affects so many lives with appalling consequences. We've heard from the Russian woman. I think now I'm going to pass over back to Alphie, and we'll talk about the Germans here.
Upon there, these two different the views of warfare. Well, not different, but the Unwomanly Face of War. It's in the title. We don't expect women to fight wars or to be involved in a total war, which this particular war was. I mean, it was, as Hitler wanted, it was a war of extermination. Now, Hitler's furious, as I say, I'm still trying to work out what Wendy Lower is trying to get at. German women were never at the front. They went to areas at the front. They went along as in the womanly role of teachers, secretaries and nurses. They didn't really know, they didn't know what war was like until they actually went. The war began to turn for the German people, and what was going on, because the Nazi killing fields, which is part of the title of this book, isn't about what was going on in the battlefront. It was about what was going on behind the battlefront, and that was the annihilation of the Jews, and how these women observed it, how it affected them, and how they did not question the regime. That's what is quite frightening, actually, when you think of it. They're actually seeing people disappear. Some of them recount being taken out by their boyfriends, who were SS officers, into the ghettos in Poland to observe the Jewish people. So think of that. People observing other people, observing their suffering. And they accepted it, basically. I think. You find that they're only Jews, and in many ways they deserve what they get. Now, just run through this and you're thinking, well, how strong was that regime? How strong was that propaganda to actually reduce people, as I said, to a rag doll? But there's other things that even when the nurses, that's what they were nurses, they weren't doctors, they weren't, there was allocated the womanly role in Nazi Germany. That was the men would take control of everything, and the women were there for a particular reason. Now, once the war began to turn, the Nazis began to observe soldiers coming back from the front with frostbite. And they couldn't quite work this out. The Weimar, the great, the great German army, splendid in their splendid uniforms, their polished boots and walking in straight lines, nothing could defeat them. So they weren't coming back from the front with bloodied wounds or like heroic paintings that the Nazis were really into, and the Russians were, in the Soviet art, the noble warrior. These were young men coming back with frostbite, losing their noses, losing their ears, losing their penises, losing their feet. They never expected this to happen. War should not be like that. But did it change them? Did it change their attitude towards what was taking place in the killing fields? And the killing fields, I keep on saying, were there for a reason: extermination. So I'm not picking up anything. I'm not picking up compassion. I'm not picking up feelings towards fellow human beings. Now, this is not an attack on Germany. This is not an attack on German people. This is an attack on an ideology that literally degraded humanity, and in so doing degraded Germany. The idea in Nazi Germany of a woman actually picking up a gun and defending the homeland was absolutely 100% non-existent. It wasn't there. It would not happen. Even in the dying days of the Reich, women were still allocated their roles. It was old men and young boys who were defending Berlin. Women were still secretaries and nurses. Now, in this country, where we're speaking from now, in Britain, women were allocated roles. They were allocated very important roles in the military, but it was nothing like the experience that was going on for the women in the Soviet Union, in the armies, because they were fighting a war of extermination. They was fighting because they knew what would happen to their homeland. They would become slaves and would end up in death camps. So the balancing between the German women and the women in war, I don't want to use the word exciting. It's about the ideology of womanhood. And the woman, the woman's body. The woman's body in Nazi Germany was, to function as a birth machine. You were there to give birth, and more children you had, the more benefits you got. Social benefits. And if you look at the sculptures in Nazi Germany of the woman's body, you might as well be looking at a sort of a man's body. With the buts, there's always the buts with this. They could not participate in the role of the community. They could not participate in the role of the actual bureaucracy. Their roles were carefully defined secretaries. Now you may, and that was it. You rarely find in the Nazi ideology women in any power, in any positions of power. Obviously there were within communities and within cities, but they were there for a reason. I keep on repeating myself. And that reason was to give birth, look after children, work in hospitals. When war came, they become observers. Those women who were in the killing fields, Poland and the Ukraine, they become observers of the destruction of a whole race of people, and not only of a whole race of people, but also millions of Russian prisoners of war. They observed that, and they spoke about it, and they spoke about it with their parents, and they spoke about it with or they shared experiences with their husbands, and they spoke about it when they came home on leave from whatever duties they were doing on the front. They'd come on, they would speak about it with their neighbours. So the argument, I think, in this book is that German people knew what was going on. But I've got a counter argument that I was talking with Alain beforehand, and that counter argument is terror. The terror of actually, you could talk about what was going on, but the one thing you could not talk about, and that was defeat. To mention that you would be murdered, you would be killed. Alan, have you got anything to say about that?
Well, that's what we were talking about earlier. I mean, Hitler's war machine was geared towards total destruction. And I mentioned earlier, as the Russians surrounded Berlin towards the end of the Second World War, Hitler, had he been of a mind to do so, could have stopped it all by surrendering. But you made the point, no, he was not of a mind to do so. He couldn't allow himself to even think it. The war was all but lost in Stalingrad when the Germans get kicked out of Russia, and the Russians pushed Germany back all across Europe into Germany, and but throughout all that time, Hitler never once thought about throwing in the towel and just saying, look, we've had enough. It was either victory or destruction. There was no in between. No total surrender. None of that. And if the German people, couldn't live up to the standards he'd set for them all, they deserved to be destroyed anyway. And that was his thinking. You know what you got to understand. That's where you get the kind of the separation. I suppose it's always existed between actual Nazism and and Germany. It was a it's a political ideology does not represent a whole country. No more then than it does now. And it's but nonetheless ideologies do affect whole countries, and the destruction wrought upon the German people was immense. We talked just before the podcast began about the Germans attacking, destroying Germans in the last couple of weeks in the war. The Germans holding show trials in the war and just totally wrecking and just putting each other on trial for perceived betrayals, and just shooting themselves or hanging themselves. It was absolutely ridiculous. I mean, they were turning on each other as the Russians closed in. It was absolutely horrifying, and it's been captured in several books. And of course, that German film Downfall, which we're both seeing, which I don't think you will never get a better representation of that moment in history on film than you will in that movie. It was absolutely stupendous.
And also in that movie as well is the role of women. The secretaries, aren't they?
That's right. I mean, that story is told through the eyes of that story. Downfall is told through the eyes of Hitler's secretary. I think it was Traudl Jungle. On whose book the movie Downfall was based, and who actually I think she appears as herself at the end of the film, holding herself up in a way as yes, I was complicit, and that I could have done something. I could have spoken out against the Nazi regime. It was possible for me to do so, but I didn't.
But it goes again. In this one, it doesn't strongly come out, but it was very difficult for anybody to talk against the regime. It was virtually impossible, particularly in the last months of the war. And there's stories in Hitler's Furies where wives and girlfriends disown their husbands and their boyfriends. They tell the Gestapo that my boyfriend or my husband has been talking about peace, and the Gestapo would sort of check it out and would come back and say, well, look, you just had an argument. Are you sure about this? And women would say, oh yeah. So the Gestapo would then tell the SS, who would come along, and they were called the Deadhead Courts, and they would interview the boyfriend or the husband, or whole family even. They would get interviewed, and then at the end of the interview they would be told, oh, this was a trial, we'll get hang you. So the whole notion of society and culture had fallen apart, and maybe, which is probably one of the things that this book is getting at, but our notion of women in the most extreme of conditions, which the end of Berlin or Germany was, we would expect, I think, that women may have risen up against all the horror that they would experience, the permanent bombing, the actual terror of the Red Army carrying out mass rapes as revenge for what happened in the Ukraine. So this idea about hopefully should get people thinking about what the hell are these ideological. The 20th century was possibly the worst century in human history, and this imbalance of how we view the role of women in war is something that I think we should still be talking about, maybe over the next weeks or what have you.
Well, it was the most destructive, and we had leaps and bounds in technology, but it's the way we use that technology for two purposes, either distraction or destruction. And the destructive power wrought upon people by wartime technology was unlike anything ever seen before in human history. When we're talking about the machine guns, tanks, nuclear bombs. Well, it was insane. Yes, gas chambers. Gas bombs. And it was really nothing like it. But I think it did get to the point. Actually, I think it was after maybe World War II, after the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that in fact total war as originally envisaged couldn't really happen, because the end point was annihilation of the human race. But I think by that time, I think they decided to kind of keep it going in smaller, equally destructive ways. I mean, at the moment, I think there's at least over 70 active conflicts in the world today. And it's absolutely nuts. And it's being supplied by people, making money out of all this technology, and it's absolutely
and I think
murderous.
I think also what we have to remember about what Hitler wanted from his very early beginnings is war. No bones about it. The countries that he conquered were not part of the overall plan. Hitler wanted the destruction of Poland and the Soviet Union, not just because of ideological reasons, but because he wanted the Aryan race to move into these lands and become farmers. If you listen to Hitler's speeches, he doesn't really talk about industry, he doesn't talk about farming even. But he had this notion that, you could just resettle hundreds of thousands of German people in these lands and they would become farmers. But underlying all of this is the fact that he himself said it was a war of extermination. It's there in the history books, you can hear him on YouTube, it's there. And that war of extermination was in the East, where subhumans were meant to live. So when women were going along, were actually going into Poland, were actually with their boyfriends, actually maybe even working as nurses on the Eastern Front in the Ukraine. They were part of that ideology. It was propaganda. They were the machines of that regime of dehumanization. And they people, I think, in that world become dehumanized. They become murderers. They actually become murderers. Now, women after the war, almost immediately after the war, they took on another role. They become builders. They began to, the role changed, but suddenly they were needed by the Allies to clear up the ruined cities. They were there, they began to clear the streets, they began to clear the sewers, they began to, they tried to put back some semblance of order. But they were never given any role of seniority. They were still women. in the sense of it will be a man's role to, in the end, to sort of rebuild the ruins of the war, and again, it's our review. If you look at the ruins of those German cities, I mean, it's pretty horrendous. I mean, they were bombed back. They were bombed back into the Stone Age. That was part and parcel of one of the Allies' objectives, to wipe Germany, to make sure that Germany would never rise again. So, as per usual, you can hear probably me and Alan trying to gather all this information, thinking, what the shit? What, and we are fast forgetting, I think, what happened. And there were women in the German women who worked in the concentration camps, but their role again was very minimal. I know it sounds awful to say. Well, I'm talking about death camps. Their role was minimal. They were there for a reason, and I mean, basically that was just to select the Jewish women into either the brothels, because there were brothels in the concentration camp, or into the gas chambers, or into work. And there wasn't a lot. I think there was a couple of hundred German women who did that, and 2 of them were hung. I'm just coming up to that in the book. So it's, as I say, it's a very confusing and damning indictment, you could say, of the 20th century. But have we learned anything from it?
Well, I think so. I mean, we had the Cold War between, the kind of like the Western powers and the Russians, where there was always that threat of total nuclear annihilation. So I'll bring over us for the best part of 50 years. 50 years you had the Cold War, or close to it, before they finally kind of they signed off on that, and it was. We've learned at least not to kind of destroy ourselves completely, but I think we've found another way of doing it anyway, because there's a lot going on in current society that is equally, if not more, destructive. We've found other ways of destroying ourselves other than that we used in the Second World War.
And this is where I'm saying that we're not learning from history. What happened in Nazi Germany was in many ways a continuation of the First World War. Because we have to remember that for a lot of the, particularly the German army, which was still vast, they refused to believe that they lost the war, that they were stabbed in the back. And a lot of the German aristocracy believed that, because the aristocracy were part of the German army. There were sort of, particularly people like Hindenburg. So there was a denial going on. But Hitler again, he boasted about reversing that defeat. He wanted vengeance. So they were getting into psychology of the man. He wanted to continue the unfinished business of the First World War. with slightly different, well, with not slightly different aims and objectives, with the objective of blaming a particular group of people, and that was the Jews, who of course were democratic, Jewish, capitalist, Jewish, wait for it, socialist, Jewish, cinema, Jewish, modern art, Jewish, modern theatre, Jewish, fashion, Jewish. So this goes on and on and on. So I think on that note, Alex, you want to?
Oh, okay. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground here, and I think what we might want to look at for our next section is basically how did all this happen, and what was Hitler really, and how did he, create all this destruction? How did he come to power to create all this destruction, and what was he, both personally and politically? That's what we're going to look at, next time.
And that opens up this whole thing.
Yeah, was he a socialist? Was he not?
Well, it opens up a whole thing about Bismarck, the unification of the German nation, and the various romantic movements that were prevalent at that particular time, before the First World War. Notably as well, the German aristocracy, which has always been very confusing. And as a starter on that, after the first, from 1918 to about 1919, Hitler was in hospital. He had been gassed, but he was a non-entity. He was a nobody. He was a failure, basically. And from 1919 to 1920 is a transformation. Something happened. He discovered his voice. Now, also, which is going to make it quite a long discussion, Germany was in a state of revolution, and there were various really extreme right-wing groups. There was the socialist Spartaist uprising with Rosa Luxemburg, which is communism. There was the poverty was absolutely diabolical. Starvation was, and death and malnutrition was massive. So it's a lot to look at. These are all of the ideas that were impacting upon Hitler. And the big one that we have to look at is the form of nationalism that he began to preach. And that ignited a flame, particularly amongst another group which we will talk about, is the Free Corps. And they were an extreme right-wing militia who went around terrorising and murdering people on quite a large scale. So it's a piece of European history that we don't talk about. Until next time, folks.
Until next time.
Goodbye.
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 Freddie.
I've got something on the floor there, Freddie.